Isabel spent her days in a bustling square, right in the heart of a big city. Her calm face with soft features hid the weight of a difficult life. Every day, early in the morning, she arrived at the square carrying her small candy stand. The people passing by were so focused on their own lives that they barely noticed her presence. To the passers-by, Isabel was just another street vendor among many, competing for attention in the midst of the chaos. She set up her stand with care, arranging each of the products she lovingly prepared. Homemade cakes, candied sweets, and crispy cookies, all made from family recipes she had learned when she was young. The smell of the fresh treats sometimes caught the attention of a passerby who, out of curiosity, would stop to buy something. But for the most part, Isabel was invisible. To most, her presence was just a background detail in the city's hectic scene. Her customers were mostly people who sympathized with her, or those who already knew her unmatched quality and flavor. Yet, they rarely saw her as a person, seeing her only as part of their daily routine. The square, surrounded by modern buildings and expensive shops, was a gathering point for executives, students, and tourists. Isabel silently watched the hurried comings and goings of the people around her, as if the world moved at a completely different pace than her own. She knew she wasn't part of that luxurious reality, and despite the weariness in her body, she kept her head held high. She sold her sweets with the dignity she had left, never allowing herself to be crushed by people's indifference. But behind her serenity was a past no one knew. One day, as Isabel organized the trays of sweets on her stand, a well-dressed man approached. His air of superiority immediately caught the attention of those nearby. The contrast between his flawless appearance and Isabel's simplicity was impossible to ignore. With a forced smile, he looked at the sweets as if analyzing something trivial. "How much is this?" he asked, pointing to one of the cakes on display. Isabel, with her soft and calm voice, told him the price, maintaining the composure she had learned over the years. The man let out a sarcastic laugh, the sound echoing in the square and attracting curious glances. "Seriously? Do you really think you'll sell this junk for that price?" he said loudly, not caring that people were beginning to stop and watch the scene. Isabel remained silent for a moment, trying to stay calm. She was used to dealing with rude, arrogant people, but every new insult felt like old wounds being reopened. "I make these sweets with great care. I have customers who love them," she replied with a gentle smile, trying to diffuse the situation. But the man wasn't ready to let it go. He glanced around as if seeking support from the small crowd gathering. "Customers? What customers? Who in their right mind would buy something from a street vendor like you? People like you will never amount to anything." His words cut deep, but Isabel stood firm. It wasn't the first time someone had publicly humiliated her, and it probably wouldn't be the last. The loneliness of that moment was all too familiar. Seeing that she wouldn't react with the anger he expected, the man shrugged, bought a sweet in a mechanical gesture, and left without so much as a thank you. As he walked away, Isabel watched in silence, feeling the weight of what had just happened. The people who had gathered to witness the conflict slowly dispersed, but Isabel could still feel their judgmental gazes. Such situations were common in her daily life, but they never stopped bothering her. The disdain people showed for someone who worked honestly to survive was one of the deepest wounds she carried. Isabel knew everyone there saw her as just another street vendor, but no one imagined who she really was or where she had come from. At the end of that day, as the sun began to set and the streets became less crowded, Isabel packed up her things and prepared to go home. She always took the same route, crossing the city with the same calm she had started her day with. But that night, something weighed more heavily on her heart. The man's words echoed in her mind, bringing back memories of a life she had left behind. A life that, for all intents and purposes, had been erased. When she arrived at her small apartment in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, Isabel allowed herself to relax for a brief moment. Sitting at the kitchen table, she looked out the window, watching the distant city lights. The contrast between the luxury and wealth that shone from those far-off lights and the simplicity of where she now lived was stark. That bright world which had once been part of her life was now just a memory. "Who am I now?" Isabel thought, her gaze lost in the distant skyline. The answer, however, was always the same. She was an ordinary woman, a street vendor struggling every day to maintain her dignity and survival. But behind this role she had taken on was a story that few knew. A story of struggle, resilience, and difficult choices that had shaped who she was today. That night, as the city's silence enveloped her small apartment, Isabel made a decision. Despite everything, she would continue. Tomorrow would be another day of work, another opportunity to keep moving forward. And maybe one day, people would finally see beyond the street vendor and discover who she truly was. Isabel woke up every day before the sun rose. The routine of preparing sweets to sell required effort and dedication, but she found in this process a moment of reflection. As she stirred the cake batter or prepared the syrup for the preserves, her mind often drifted back in time, recalling a life she preferred to leave behind, but that still invaded her thoughts. It was a life filled with success, comfort, and for a while, even happiness. Years earlier, Isabel had been known by a different name and held a respected place in society. She owned a rapidly growing artisanal confectionery business, with stores spread across various neighborhoods. Her skill in the kitchen was praised, and her management abilities admired. The hard work and sleepless nights seemed to finally be paying off with a promising future. Back then, Isabel's life revolved around meetings, contracts, and expanding her business. But what people didn't know was that her professional success came at a high personal cost. Her relationship with her husband, Julio, had grown cold and distant. They had married young, both filled with dreams and plans. But as Isabel devoted more and more time to her business, Julio felt increasingly left behind. He began sinking into debt and failed ventures that only widened the gap between them. The breaking point came when Julio made disastrous financial decisions, using Isabel's business name as collateral. Without her knowledge, he had mortgaged part of the confectionery's assets to cover his personal losses. When the debt spiraled out of control, the shock was devastating. Isabel lost much of the control over her business, and Julio, consumed by guilt and shame, decided to leave, abandoning her to deal with the fallout alone. The fall was swift. The reputation Isabel had built over the years crumbled within months. The business, once a source of pride, became associated with bankruptcy and insurmountable debt. Isabel tried every possible way to regain control and recover what she had lost, but the pressure was too great. Doors closed, friends disappeared, and in the end, she was left alone, without a business, without a husband, and without resources. As these memories flooded her mind, Isabel continued stirring the pots, as if the repetitive work helped her maintain control over emotions that had yet to heal. Over time, she moved to a distant neighborhood, far removed from the places she used to frequent. The decision to disappear from the radar was deliberate. She wanted to start over without the burden of a name now associated with failure. Few people knew the truth. Isabel kept her past a secret, even from the few customers who had stayed by her side during the collapse. To the new circle of people she met in her day-to-day life as a street vendor, she was just Isabel, a simple woman trying to make a living selling sweets. The contrast between her former life and her current one was glaring, but in some way, she found a strange sense of freedom in this new identity. There was no longer the pressure to maintain a perfect image or the constant anxiety of meeting others' expectations. Despite the relief, Isabel still bore the deep scars of her downfall. From time to time, an old client recognized her in the streets, and she had to endure looks of pity or, worse, morbid curiosity. In such moments, Isabel limited herself to polite smiles and short words. There was no more room in her life for that past. Once, while selling sweets in the square, an old acquaintance from high society, Helena, showed up unexpectedly. Helena was one of the few who knew Isabel's true story, but upon seeing her in that situation, selling on the street, she couldn't hide her shock. "Isabel, I can't believe it's you," she exclaimed, trying to mask her discomfort while glancing around as if not wanting to be seen talking to her. Isabel, in turn, kept her composure. She knew this moment would come sooner or later. "Yes, it's me, Helena. It's been a long time, hasn't it?" she replied with the same calm smile she used in awkward situations. Helena, however, was anxious. She tried to ask about Isabel's current life, but couldn't conceal her unease at seeing her in such conditions. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, with Helena clearly eager to leave as soon as possible. When she finally departed, Isabel felt the familiar weight of societal expectations pressing on her shoulders. That night, back home, Isabel reflected on the encounter. She had long stopped caring about what people from her old circle thought of her new life. But Helena's visit served as a reminder that, no matter how hard she tried, the past would always find a way to resurface. She sighed as she tidied up her small kitchen. No matter what happened, Isabel was determined to keep moving forward with the life she had chosen. Living out of the spotlight was both a blessing and a curse. But Isabel believed she had made the right choice. The world of luxury and status she once knew was hollow, devoid of meaning. Now, despite the hardships, she felt she had finally found some sense of purpose. The days passed in a nearly monotonous routine for Isabel as she followed her daily rhythm of preparing sweets and setting up her stand in the same corner of the square. However, the weight of humiliation and judgmental stares she had endured over the years began to accumulate. Every time she was treated with disdain or indifference, it was as if a small part of her inner strength drained away. Isabel, always calm and composed on the outside, started to feel cracks forming in her facade. One day, when the square was particularly busy, another public humiliation occurred. A young woman, hurried and visibly irritated, approached Isabel's stand. Her quick steps and impatient look suggested that something had already gone wrong in her day. She ordered a sweet, but when Isabel told her the price, the woman responded with contempt. "You've got to be kidding me? That price for a street sweet? Even in the city center, they don't charge this much for something so basic." Isabel tried to maintain her usual calm tone, explaining that all her products were handmade with quality ingredients, and that many of her customers appreciated the homemade flavor. But the woman wasn't interested in hearing any of it. She raised her voice, drawing the attention of people passing by in the square. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "You're trying to scam people. Just because you sell on the street, you think you can charge whatever you want? This isn't some fancy shop. You should be ashamed of exploiting people like this." Isabel, accustomed to such disdain, held her composure. She knew that reactions like this were not uncommon, but something felt different this time. The cruel tone of the young woman and the disapproving looks from the people around her started to weigh more heavily. The woman's words weren't just criticisms of the price, but a direct attack on Isabel's worth as a person. "People like you never go anywhere," she said with an air of disdain before walking off. That day, something inside Isabel shifted. The constant humiliation, the silent judgments, and now this direct assault on her dignity were starting to erode her emotional resilience. That night, back home, she found herself questioning her decision to restart her life this way. "Is this really worth it?" she thought. "Should I keep fighting for a place where no one sees me?" The thoughts of giving up began to surface more frequently, until one morning, Isabel woke up with no desire to get out of bed. For the first time in years, she seriously considered abandoning everything. The cruel words of the young woman still echoed in her mind, mixed with the memories of all she had lost. It felt as though the battle for her dignity was becoming unbearable. Yet, something deep inside prevented her from giving up that day. Isabel forced herself to get up, prepare her sweets, and head to the square as she did every day. But the spark that had once kept her going, even in the face of difficulties, had dimmed. With every sweet she sold and every forced smile she gave her customers, she felt herself growing more distant from who she once was. The simple life that had once seemed like a refuge now began to feel like an emotional prison. It was in this state of mind that, weeks later, Isabel encountered another twist of fate. The square, which had always been her safe space, became the stage for another turning point in her life. On that day, while she was selling her sweets, Isabel noticed something unusual. There were more people than usual, and they all seemed to be gathering for a business event at one of the nearby buildings. She soon realized that a well-known local businessman, Artur Silveira, was present. The event was a kind of business fair, and Isabel couldn't help but remember her own days as a businesswoman when she attended similar events, hoping to expand her company. Artur Silveira passed by Isabel's stand with his entourage of advisors. He didn't pay much attention to her, but something about their brief encounter made Isabel's heart race. His name sounded too familiar. Then, it hit her. Artur was one of the people responsible for a company merger that, years ago, had directly impacted her former confectionery business. He had been part of one of the consortiums that had bought shares of her company when the debts had piled up. Isabel watched as Artur and his team walked by, oblivious to her existence. He didn't recognize her, of course. To him, she was nothing more than a street vendor, completely insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But for Isabel, that brief encounter stirred painful memories and a fresh wave of frustration. This was the man who had, indirectly, contributed to her downfall. Though he wasn't solely responsible, his company had profited from the collapse of her confectionery business. Isabel felt a mix of anger and helplessness. The past she had tried so hard to forget was right there in front of her, in the flesh, walking casually through the square as if nothing had ever happened. That night, alone in her small apartment, Isabel finally allowed herself to feel the emotions she had been repressing for so long. She cried. She cried for the humiliations, for the losses, for the injustice of seeing those who had profited from her ruin move on with their lives as if nothing had happened. For the first time in years, Isabel let her facade of strength completely crumble. But deep in her heart, something began to stir. The pain, mixed with frustration, brought with it a new sense of determination. Isabel knew she couldn't go back to who she once was, but she wasn't willing to continue being treated as less than she truly was. From that day forward, she made a decision. Her story wasn't over yet. After the unexpected encounter with Artur Silveira, Isabel's mind was unsettled for days. The memory of her downfall, tied to the face of the businessman who had crossed her path, ignited a new feeling within her. Isabel had resigned herself to accept her condition, but something about that encounter reawakened an old spark. What was left of her as a businesswoman and a strong woman still existed, buried under the layers of humiliation and frustration she had faced for so long. That night, after another day of work in the square, Isabel couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her heart restless. In the middle of the night, she got up and went to the small table in her kitchen, taking out an old notebook she had kept hidden away. Inside, among recipes for sweets and financial notes, were the plans she had made years ago when her business was on the rise. The dreams she had nurtured of expanding her business and conquering new markets seemed distant now, almost unreal. But something had changed. For the first time in a long while, Isabel felt that she couldn't continue living the way she had. She knew she couldn't simply return to what she had been before. But she also no longer wanted to content herself with being just an invisible figure in the square. Determined, she began to think of ways to regain her dignity and rebuild her life, even if in a different way. A few weeks later, Isabel continued her routine as a street vendor, but with a renewed sense of purpose. Something in her demeanor had shifted, though it went unnoticed by others. As she sold her sweets, she observed the people around her with a new perspective. Then, an unexpected turn of events occurred. On an otherwise ordinary day, as Isabel was serving her usual customers, an elegant woman with short hair and a confident posture stopped in front of her stand. She looked vaguely familiar. It took Isabel a few seconds to recognize her, but then the memory came flooding back. It was Marina, an old business associate, someone Isabel hadn't seen in years, since the fall of her confectionery. Marina looked at Isabel with wide eyes, clearly surprised. It took her a moment to speak, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "Isabel?" she asked, her voice shaky. Isabel took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes, it's me, Marina. It's been a long time, hasn't it?" Marina shook her head in disbelief. "I can't believe this. What happened to you? How did you end up here?" Isabel, maintaining her serenity, gave a soft smile. "Life took some unexpected turns, but I'm fine. And you, still in the business world?" Marina, still in shock, replied, "Isabel, you were one of the most promising businesswomen I knew. How can you be selling sweets on the street now? It doesn't make sense." Though her words were filled with surprise, they didn't hurt Isabel as they might have months ago. She had changed, grown stronger. "Things changed, Marina. I faced some hardships, and now I'm starting over. Things don't always go as planned, Isabel answered with calm confidence. But Marina seemed shaken. She kept trying to understand how a woman with Isabel's talent could have ended up in such a situation. As their conversation unfolded, people began to notice the interaction between the two women. A small crowd started gathering around Isabel's stand, curious to hear what was going on. Marina, seemingly unaware of the attention they were drawing, began explaining to the onlookers who Isabel really was. "Do you know who this woman is?" Marina asked the crowd. Isabel was one of the top confectionery entrepreneurs in this city. She had a chain of stores, a brilliant career. You're looking at someone who once had everything, and now she's here, selling sweets like she's just another street vendor. The people around them began whispering. Most had no idea who Isabel truly was. To them, she had always been just another street vendor. But with Marina's revelation, all eyes were now fixed on her. Some expressed surprise, others curiosity, but there were also those who looked at her with disdain, as if Isabel's failure justified her current situation. Isabel, however, wasn't shaken. She knew this moment of public exposure was inevitable, but she was prepared. She thanked Marina for her concern, but made it clear that she didn't regret the path she had chosen. "Life has a strange way of testing us, Marina. I've been through a lot, and I'm a different person now. I'm not that businesswoman anymore, but I'm stronger today." This public revelation, which might have devastated her months ago, now served as an opportunity for Isabel to reaffirm who she had become. The self-respect she carried was intact, and despite the judgmental stares, Isabel felt a sense of liberation. At last, people knew her story, but more importantly, Isabel knew who she had become. After the encounter with Marina, small changes began to occur. The people who frequented the square started looking at Isabel with newfound respect. Those who had ignored her before now treated her with curiosity, as if trying to understand the story behind the woman. Isabel, for her part, continued her routine, allowing her past to surface without letting it interfere with her new life. But one man, in particular, who had once humiliated her, returned to her stand. He was visibly uncomfortable, burdened by the harsh words he had once spoken. "I heard your story," he began, his voice hesitant. "I was unfair. I had no idea who you were." Isabel, without bitterness, replied serenely, "You didn't know, and that's okay. But words carry weight, no matter who we are." The man stood in silence for a few moments, clearly ashamed. He didn't push for more apologies or explanations, simply bought a sweet and walked away. For Isabel, that small interaction confirmed that she was now in control of her own narrative. Her story was out in the open, but what truly mattered was how she would handle the future. After the unexpected revelation of Isabel's past, the square was never the same. The people who frequented the area began to look at her with newfound curiosity. Those who had barely noticed her presence before now made a point to greet her, though often with a hint of hesitation. Some respected her for her resilience, while others were simply intrigued, trying to understand how a woman with so much talent and success could end up selling sweets on the street. Isabel, however, remained steady. Despite the change in people's attitudes, she didn't alter her routine. She still woke up early, prepared her sweets with the same care, and set up her stand in the square. But inside, something had shifted. It wasn't just the curiosity of those around her that unsettled her, but the feeling that perhaps she had allowed her circumstances to define her for too long. As time passed, more people began to approach Isabel, not just to buy her sweets, but to listen to her story. Old customers, who once saw her as just another street vendor, now asked about her former confectionery, about her life before everything collapsed. Isabel, although reluctant at first, began to share her story, but she framed it differently, highlighting the lessons she had learned along the way, rather than focusing on the losses she had suffered. Among these newfound admirers was Donna Celia, an elderly woman who regularly passed through the square but rarely interacted with Isabel. After hearing the story of the businesswoman turned street vendor, Donna Celia approached one day with an unusual request. "Isabel, I heard about your talent for cakes. I'm having a birthday soon, and I'd like you to make the cake for the party, something special, like you used to do at your confectionery." Isabel smiled, surprised by the request. It had been years since she had prepared a large cake for an event. The sweets she sold were simple, without much complexity, but the cake Donna Celia requested was something more elaborate, something that brought her back to her days as a renowned pastry chef. Nevertheless, Isabel accepted the challenge. It was as if, slowly, she was reconnecting with the person she had been before everything fell apart. That same day when she returned home, Isabel felt a mix of nostalgia and anxiety. Preparing this cake would be more than just a job. It would be a test for herself, a way to discover whether she still had the talent and passion that had once made her so successful. Over the following weeks, she devoted herself completely to the task, searching for the best ingredients and experimenting with new recipes, just as she had done in the past. When the day of the party arrived, Isabel delivered the cake to Donna Celia with the same dedication she had shown when she owned her confectionery. The cake, covered in white frosting and decorated with delicate sugar flowers, was a work of art. Seeing the joyful expressions on the faces of the party guests, Isabel felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: recognition. Not the public recognition of being at the top of a big company, but the acknowledgement of her hard work, dedication, and passion. After the success of the cake, more orders started coming in. Old customers who remembered her bakery began seeking her out again, asking her to make cakes and sweets for special events. Isabel, although surprised by the response, accepted the orders cautiously. She didn't want to return to the frenetic pace of her past, but she couldn't ignore the fact that, for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was regaining an important part of her life. It was within this context of rediscovery that Isabel began to notice the transformation in how people viewed her. They no longer saw her as just a street vendor. Now, there was a renewed respect in their eyes, as if they finally understood her true value. The square, which had once been merely a backdrop for humiliations and disdain, was now becoming a place of reconnections and rediscoveries. However, the most important transformation wasn't in the way others saw her, but in how Isabel saw herself. For years she had felt invisible, hiding her true identity, but now, by confronting her past and allowing it to be known, Isabel was beginning to see herself differently. What mattered most was no longer status or public recognition, but the inner peace that came with accepting her own journey. Even so, Isabel couldn't ignore the fact that, now more than ever, she was being watched. Some saw her as an inspiration, others with lingering suspicion, and there were those who tried to understand how a woman who had lost everything could maintain such dignity. Among these observers was Artur Silveira, the businessman who had crossed Isabel's path weeks earlier. Artur, now aware of Isabel's past, decided to approach her again. He appeared in the square one day, discreetly, and bought one of the sweets she was selling. As he made his purchase, he watched her for a few moments, as if trying to gauge the impact of his presence. Finally, he spoke. "I heard you used to be a great businesswoman, Isabel." She raised her eyes, surprised by his comment, but maintained her calm demeanor. "Yes, I was for a time," she replied without emotion. Artur seemed to hesitate but continued. "I didn't know that when we crossed paths before, but after hearing your story, I was impressed. Few people could go through what you did and still stand tall." Isabel gave a faint smile. "It wasn't easy, but life doesn't give us much choice, does it? We either move forward or get swallowed by our circumstances." Artur nodded, as if pondering her words. "I'm organizing a food event soon," he said, changing the subject. "It seems your talent for sweets is still highly appreciated. I'd like to invite you to participate." Isabel remained silent for a moment. It was the first time in years that someone had offered her an opportunity like this. To participate in a food event organized by Artur Silveira, the same man who had been indirectly linked to her downfall, felt ironic, but it also presented an opportunity to show that she wasn't defined by her failures. With a calm smile, Isabel replied, "Thank you for the offer, Artur. I'll think about it." Artur nodded, and with a slight gesture of farewell walked away. For Isabel, this moment wasn't just about a new professional opportunity. It was about how much her story was changing, not only in the minds of others, but most importantly, in her own perception of herself. In the days following Artur Silveira's proposal, Isabel found herself torn. Participating in a culinary event could be an opportunity to reclaim some of the prestige she had lost. It would allow her to showcase the talent and skill that had once made her confectionery famous. But Isabel questioned whether that was what she truly wanted. Since becoming a street vendor, she had found a new rhythm to life, a simplicity that, in some ways, comforted her. There were no longer the pressures of running a business, nor the constant chase for success. Instead, there was the quiet, daily work that connected her directly to the people around her. However, Arthur's proposal brought a dilemma she couldn't ignore. Should she move forward and accept the new opportunity, or remain true to the life she had rebuilt? That week, as she mulled over her decision, Isabel continued with her routine. The square, once the stage for her humiliations and small victories, now felt different. People treated her with respect, and her sweets were more in demand than ever. But beyond her business's newfound success, Isabel sensed something deeper was happening. The people's gazes no longer held pity or disdain, but admiration. One day, while arranging her stand, Donna Celia, the customer for whom Isabel had made the birthday cake, approached. "Isabel, I heard you were invited to a big event. That's wonderful, my dear. You must accept. Show everyone your talent." Donna Celia encouraged with a warm smile. Isabel returned the smile, but inside, she still wasn't sure. "I've been thinking about it, Donna Celia. It's an opportunity, yes, but also a big step for me. I need to reflect on whether it's really what I want." Donna Celia observed her for a moment, her expression understanding. "You've been through so much, Isabel. Maybe it's time to show the world the value you carry." After her conversation with Donna Celia, Isabel grew even more contemplative. That evening, at home, she gazed out of her window, watching the city lights in the distance as she often did. She pondered the path she had walked, her former life as a businesswoman, the years of struggle in the streets, and now this new chance to reclaim something of what she had lost. But something within her caused hesitation. Isabel no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone, not even to herself. In the following days, Isabel sought clarity in a different way. She visited the place where her old confectionery had stood, now replaced by another establishment. As she walked through the street where she had spent years building her business, she felt a blend of nostalgia and relief. The bakery she had loved so dearly was part of the past, and though the memories were sweet, Isabel knew she didn't want to return to that pace of life. It was then that Isabel realized the answer she had been searching for wasn't in regaining prestige, but in holding on to the peace she had found. The simplicity of her new life, the direct connection with people, and the freedom of not being tied to the pressures of success were, to her, a form of wealth that couldn't be measured by public recognition. With this newfound clarity, Isabel made her decision. The next day, she returned to the square, just as she always did, but with a lighter heart. People greeted her with smiles, some commenting on the upcoming culinary event. When Artur Silvera passed by her stand again, Isabel already knew what she would say. He greeted her with a smile and asked if she had thought about his offer. "I've thought about it, Artur," Isabel replied, her voice calm and steady, "and I appreciate the opportunity, but I've decided not to participate." Artur, surprised, stood in silence for a moment before responding. "I didn't expect that. Are you sure? It would be a great chance to showcase your talent again." Isabel nodded with the same sense of peace. "Yes, I'm sure. I spent too much time chasing success and recognition, but now I've found something far more valuable. What matters to me now is the simplicity of the life I've chosen. I'm not looking for big opportunities, just to live with dignity, doing what I love." Artur watched her for a few seconds, as if reflecting on her words. "I respect your decision, Isabel. It's not easy to turn down something like this, but I understand that you found your path." He offered a respectful nod before walking away. Isabel felt a deep sense of peace. As time passed, Isabel continued to live her simple life, selling her sweets in the square. The respect she had earned was no longer about her past, but about the person she had become. Each day she strengthened her connections with the people around her, creating bonds that went beyond what a business or financial success could ever offer. In the end, Isabel's story was no longer about her downfall or her rise. It was about her conscious choice to live with authenticity. She had come to understand that true wealth was found in simplicity, in the value of small things, and most importantly, in the freedom to be who she truly was, without needing to prove anything to anyone. In the end, Isabel found her own definition of success, not in awards or public recognition, but in the quiet peace of a life lived according to her own values.